Frank Frascino.
Hey, glad to be aboard, man. How are you?
Pretty good, Frank. Welcome to the Edge television broadcast. First time on the show for you. Appreciate you coming on tonight.
Yeah, glad to be here, Daniel.
All right.
Got a lot to talk about tonight, man.
Well, we do, and we're going to get into it hot and heavy. I've got a lot of graphics that you sent that we'll put in our background there so people can look at that to find out exactly what the rendition of this Flatwood Monster thing is. We'll go to a lot of different places with this show tonight. But Frank, welcome to the program. Let's get into a little bit of history to introduce you to our audience here. Now, as you know, we stream the show live on the live stream and on our website, and we also are simulcasting it on our TuneIn radio channel. So there's a couple ways for people to watch the show. They'll send in questions as we go along, so it may not exactly be on topic. So be prepared, because some folks have something on their mind that we never even thought about. You ready?
All right, let's shoot.
All right, well, introduce yourself, and how did you get into looking into this here, what you call the Flatwoods Monster?
Well, the Flatwoods Monster, also known as the Braxton County Monster, kind of has two names because when this story hit back in 1952, it shotgun around the world pretty quick, Daniel. And what happened is Flatwoods was so small, it's the center point of West Virginia. It wasn't on a map, so nobody knew how to get there. So it became the Braxton County Monster. So that kind of straightened that right off the bat. Mm-hmm. It was actually one of the top news stories in 1952. Now, as many of the listeners may know already, 1952 was the banner year for UFO sightings. Mm-hmm. Project Blue Book had the most reported sightings in its 17 years existence. There was 1,501 reports. And during the summer of 1952, had a record amount of UFO sightings seen throughout the world, and especially over the United States and over the Washington area. And the Flatwoods Monster incident was an alien crash occupant incident that happened in the town of Flatwoods. Now, if you look at a map, it's the geographical center of the state, and it's approximately 200 miles west of Washington. And we get into the story a little bit later that's going to come into play. Mm-hmm. And I just stumbled onto this Flatwoods Monster story. I have relatives who live in Braxton County, and Frametown and Flatwoods, which are in the same vicinity, about 17 miles apart. And I just kind of stumbled onto this story. I was driving in with my cousin into the town of Flatwoods, and I saw this big, gigantic sign on the side of the road, said, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster." And at that point, I was a little bit intrigued with it, but nobody would talk to me. And I found out that it's a very tight-knit, clannish community with the people up there. And I was deemed as an outsider. Mm-hmm. And it took me a lot of years to gain the trust of the people that I was working with. And it wasn't easy right off the bat. Nobody had figured out what had actually happened up there, because the whole community had shut down, because when this monster hit, the newswire services, what had happened is the press started giving the whole story a negative angle, and the people were just laughed at and called hillbillies amongst a million other, ridiculous names. So with how they handled the whole situation is they just shut up and basically went into hiding and didn't talk about it for decades. I became involved in it in 1991, and that's when I discovered this story. And it just started out as, a little something to do on the side. Mm-hmm. I went back to college. I graduated from Park College of Art in New Haven, Connecticut, and then I moved down to Florida, and I went to film and video production school. And at that point, I started putting a small little documentary together as a class project. And I had a teacher take me under his wing, showed me how to operate cameras, how to interview people, and basically I was off to the races at that point. Mm-hmm. I started going back and forth to West Virginia dozens of times over the years, mm-hmm. getting interviews with all the key witnesses. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Kathleen May, she was the primary witness, Daniel. She saw the monster from close range, about the length of a car, that night when this whole incident happened. Mm-hmm. And I started working with Kathleen. I started pulling out documents and different newspaper articles from around the United States. Now, Daniel, this is over the course of several years. Okay, this didn't happen overnight. But once I gained the trust of Mrs. May, and she saw how serious I had become with this, and just pursuing it and going after it, she started introducing me to other key players involved in this. Mm-hmm. And over the years, I was interviewing all these people. Mm-hmm. And then I eventually put together my book, and I revised it over the years. And what had happened, Daniel, is when I came out with my first couple books on the topic, what had happened is by doing radio shows like this, far-reaching around the world, people started contacting me and telling me more parts of the story, sending me newspaper articles. Mm-hmm. So my books kept getting outdated very quickly. Mm-hmm. So I have this is my most recent book. It's the revised and updated edition of the Flatwoods Monster case. So that's kind of how I started this whole thing. I basically stumbled into it, and it just became a lifelong project.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So you gained the trust of Miss May. Now, one of the things that sets this story apart, of course, is that there was, I don't know if I read somewhere it said an organic monster, but I'm not really sure whether it's organic or metallic, but some entity of some kind was apparently had got out of this craft. Is that right?
Yes. That's what was called the Flatwoods Monster. Mm-hmm. And the big misconception about the monster, Daniel, is when this monster was shown on television to a live audience, a sketch artist, We the People, had contacted the We the People program, which was hosted by Daniel Seymour. They actually contacted Kathleen May, one of the other boy witnesses, Gene Lemon, and the newspaper reporter who broke the story to the press. They went to New York City, and they did an interview with them. And the sketch artist sat down, and he was talking to May and Lemon, and he was asking them for descriptions of what this thing looked like. So he sat there with this. It was approximately a little over 2 by 3 foot sketch. Mm-hmm. And they're sitting there, they're explaining this thing, and he does this sketch of his interpretation, which was wrong. Mm-hmm. And what they did is they turned it around to the television audience. They had a live orchestra playing, the crescendo of the music raised up and blasted, and they showed this ridiculous drawing on national television. And it didn't look like that. Mm-hmm. That's the old black and white drawing that's been seen in a million different books and periodicals.
Mm-hmm. Are you, by the way, Frank, are you watching the show, or are you just on the phone?
Pardon?
Are you watching this show now?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just glancing at my computer.
Okay, so is this...
Here's the original sketch that's superimposed up against the tree. To the right there, you can see the tree. That's an actual photograph of where the incident took place. Gray Barker, one of the original investigators, what he did is he took that drawing there that you see to the left, and he superimposed it on top of that photograph. Now, as you can see, the monster has arms and claws there, and it's wearing a long draped type dress. Well, what happened is when Mrs. May was talking to the sketch artist, now you have to remember, central West Virginia back in 1952 was desolate. There were no interstates, Daniel. People had to drive for hours just from a couple towns away just to get into Flatwoods. And Mrs. May is trying to describe this entity that she saw, which was basically a tall metallic structure. Excuse me. And what happened is she's trying to describe the lower torso of this being, which had pipes. It was metallic, and it was flared out like the booster rocket of a booster rocket lower portion. And she said the rolls of the pipes reminded her of the drapes in her living room, the curtains. Mm-hmm. So what the artist did is instead of drawing pipes in the illustration, he took her interpretation literally, and he put it in a dress and made it to look like drapes. What this creature was, it was approximately 12 foot tall metallic spacecraft. And the arms that you see in this illustration were actually an exaggeration. What the witnesses told me is that they were actually some type of antenna devices coming off of the tops of the shoulders. Mm-hmm. And we'll eventually get to the the photographs of the monster, what it really looked like. And this illustration here was the one of Gray Barker. His composite there, that's what was seen over the years, which was completely wrong. And right here is one of the original illustrations when I sat down with Freddie May. Freddie May, at the time, was just a kid. He was Kathleen's youngest boy. I sat down with him, and he did this actual illustration, and we worked together on it. And that's at the point where, myself being an illustrator, I just did police-style renderings, Daniel. I sat down with these people, usually in the living room at our coffee shop, and we would just shoot the breeze, and I would show them the research I had, and I would always have a sketch pad and a camera, and I would sit down with the people. This particular one was drawn by Freddie. I helped him somewhat because he's not an artist. But we did this in his living room in Gasaway, West Virginia. And between talking with Freddie, the different witnesses, and Kathleen, that's when I discovered that this thing was actually a machine. It wasn't something wearing a dress.
Yeah, you know, when I first saw these renditions here, I thought of something else. I'm going to put that up on screen here real quickly. I thought of this right here. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
Well, it floats, and it's on a mission, and it's looking for Kirok. So, and I think it's going to kill us all. So, then we're considering then that it was a metallic object. So, is it that a robot then, a flying robot, or that's levitating, was actually flying the craft?
Yes. Well, what happened is this thing touched down, Daniel, on the back part of the Bailey Fisher farm. There was a bunch of kids playing on the elementary school playground. And they saw this thing fly over, and it was approximately 32 feet long, approximately 16 to 18 feet high, and it was shaped like an egg, almost like an egg or an oval type craft. And it basically looked the same on both ends. The witnesses said one side was just a little bit bigger, but basically egg-shaped, and it flew over their heads on a playground. It was about 7:25 on September 12th, 1952, and it flew across the main interstate road there, 4, and it stopped in midair across the street on the top of the Fisher farm, and it dropped down, and it started glowing throughout the whole area. Now, what's interesting, Daniel, is where this thing dropped down is one of the highest plateau areas in that region. And when you look at this mountain range, it looks like a bald spot on somebody's head. This thing landed in a clearing void of the trees. And this is at the point where all the kids went running up the street, and they went to Kathleen May's house. And they went barging into the house, and they said they saw something landing up on the back hill. And the oldest boy, Gene Lemon, him and Kathleen had taken flashlights, and they made their trek up to the back farm, which bordered the Fisher farm and the May property, basically bordered. And
now,
how far they went up to the farm to see what had touched down.
Okay, Frank, let me ask you, how far from the crash site was this entity seen?
It was seen probably an eighth of a mile, approximately, because what it did, Daniel, is once it touched down on the top of the mountain, the boy said they can see this thing glowing, and I later interviewed Jack Davis, an adult witness, who was in the area, and he was a truck driver at the time. And Jack told me he saw the thing come down, and I actually did an interview with him and did some sketches, and it was the same descriptions he saw from a different point of town. And he said when it touched down, you could see this thing pulsing and glowing throughout the whole mountaintop. And what it did is it actually relocated into the lower portion of the farm, which is at the midpoint of the farm, into a gully. And there was a small pear orchard there with a bunch of trees, and it located itself in the lower portion of the farm, so it couldn't be seen readily. And at that point, Mrs. May and all the kids, and there was a couple dogs there. There was a neighborhood collie dog that had come up with the boys, and May and Lemon, the oldest two, they were leading the pack, and they were walking up across the first pasture of the farm. They were looking way out in the back where they saw this thing touch down, but what had happened, because it relocated, it was over to the right-hand side, tucked away by the trees, and it started glowing, and it started glowing more. Mm-hmm. And they came up to a gate, and it was like a cattle gate. It was a big steel gate. And the boys opened it up. They swung it back. All of them passed through it. Now, at this time, you have a whole bunch of kids. You got Kathleen May. I'm going to give you a quick rundown, Daniel. Okay. We had Gene Lemon, who was 17 years old. We had a 14-year-old Neil Nunley. Teddy Neal, he was 13. Eddie May, he was 13. And Freddie May, the brother, who was 11. Those were Kathleen's two kids. We had Ronnie Shaver, a 10-year-old kid. Those kids were on the playground, and then a little boy had tagged along. His name was Tommy Heyer, and Tommy was 6. So we had this wagon train of kids going up the hill to look to see what the hell touched down back up there, okay? It's starting to get a little dark at this point. They hadn't used their flashlights on at this point because Mrs. May and Freddie May told me, when you go out into the woods, you absolutely do not use your flashlights unless you have to, because they didn't know how long they were going to be up on the far back, and they didn't want the batteries, which were crummy back then, to go dead and then have to walk in the pitch black all the way back home, approximately a mile. So they closed the gate. The collie dog was leading the pack, and it started darting off ahead, and it's going up this windy, what they called up there back in the day, Dan, it was called a wagon path or a wagon trail. And this is the area where they would come in and out, the main access part of the farm, where they had horses and cattle. Down to the right-hand side is where the gully is, and now this path starts inclining uphill to go to the back where they saw it touch down. I'm trying to lay the property out here so the listener gets an idea. Yeah. To the left-hand side of the path is the woods. Now, at this point, Mrs. May starts moving up a little bit quicker with Lemon. They're walking up, and the path bends to the left. And the dog darts off like a bat out of hell. It goes up the hill, and it disappears around the bend. At about this time, they started noticing this weird fog rolling down from the upper portion of the farm, and it's coming down the path. Mm-hmm. And the witnesses described it as like a low fog rolling in, except it was like a sulfur smell, like rotten eggs, and it smelled terrible. And Freddie told me it
hang on for a second,
like
Frank.
Something metallic burning.
Okay, Frank. Well, that egg smell is sometimes referred to, or some people interpret that as sulfur.
Exactly.
And that being the case, it was also noted that where demons materialize into this dimension, that there is a sulfuric.
It was a sulfuric smell.
Mm-hmm.
And Freddie also told me it smelled. It had a metallic burning smell. Now, here's another key point, Daniel. Freddie told me it was hard for some of the younger kids to see because there was brush along the path to the right and to the left, and some of the kids couldn't look over this tall growing brush to see where the craft was sitting out in the distance, but they saw this pulsing noise. Now, Freddie told me distinctly he remembered. Now, Freddie was towards the end of the wagon train, okay? He told me he heard this whining, pitched noise. It was like a whining, squealing noise out in the distance, and it sounded like something winding up, like a generator. And he said that noise stuck in his head for his whole life, and when he ended up as an adult, he worked at Union Carbide in Charleston, and he said that the first day he worked in a factory, when they shut the big generators down with that whining noise, whining down, he said that was the same type of noise he heard out in the distance in the pasture, and that's where the craft was. It was some type of a system. some type of a generator, and the bell went off from when he was a kid. And he said, Frank, that's the same type of noise I heard. Well, anyways, they continue walking up. This whining noise is going on. The dog yelps up ahead, starts barking and barking and going nuts, and it turns around and hightails, and it comes back down and it passes May and Lemon and all the kids right back down the path. Right about this time, there was a second gate, Daniel, and it wasn't a swinging gate or a fence. There was a portion of the path where there was two posts, and there were big pieces of wood going from post to pillar, and they were nailed in there. And that was as far as you could go until you climb over. Well, what happened is Mrs. May went over the fence. She went over the fence, and she went over with Lemon, Neil Nunley, Eddie, and Ronnie.
All right.
And the dog is passing by him. The dog jumped over the fence. The fence is still, the posts are still there. I've documented all this on video.
All right.
And it was about 3 to 3.5 foot high, the top rung of wood. So Mrs. May's walking closer up with Lemon. At this point, Freddie May, Teddy Neal, and Tommy Heyer, they had come up to the fence while the rest of them walked ahead. Now, at this point, this is when Mrs. May said that the fog started getting thicker and the stench was even worse, and the whole area starting to fill up with this fog. She noted off to the left portion of the path, set about 4 feet back, there was this big oak tree, and it was about 100 feet tall. She started approaching up into the area of this tree, and this is where the origin point of this smoke is, and where the smell is. She told me she first noted, coming from that tree area to her left, it was a noise that sounded like a low, rhythmic thumping noise. And I said, what do you mean, Kathleen, by that description? She said it sounded like a beating of a drum, and her exact words were, it was like taking a piece of stretched canvas and dropping a quarter or a $50, thud, 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 and but it was rhythmic. And she also heard this crackling noise, something like something burning and frying. She says it sounded like bacon in a frying pan sizzling. Something hot was up around that tree. As they started getting closer, Mrs. May walked ahead of Lemon, and they both had their flashlights off at this point because it wasn't completely dark. It was just dark into the patch area to the left where the woods were. And Mrs. May and Lemon looked up to the left where all this stuff was going on, and they noticed approximately 12 feet up in the air, they saw a pair of eyes.
Whoa.
Now, this is set back, Daniel. This tree is set back 4 feet off the path, and it's up a slope. So it's actually up about 2 to 3 feet. So they froze and they looked up there. They thought they were the eyes of an animal because they were like an orange color. And they were set way the hell up there, about 12 feet up. And they're looking, and now it's getting a little bit darker, and the backdrop set, it's darker because that's where the woods are. Well, Mrs. May said she looked at this thing. She thought it was an eyes of an animal, a raccoon or a possum, and that's what the same conclusion that Nunley and Gene Lemon, they were all kind of close together there. They both clicked their flashlights and directed them up towards the beams. That's when they got the shock of their life. It wasn't an animal in a tree on a branch, as they thought. Once they hit this thing, it actually reacted, Daniel, to them. Now, talking to Mrs. May, I've probably talked to her a million hours, and with some of the witnesses, this isn't like one interview. This is years and years. What happened is this thing actually reacted to Mrs. May, this tall metallic structure.
Really?
It lifted off the ground, and Mrs. May said it seemed to glow from the inside. Now, the eyes were not...
let me stop you right there, Frank. Let me clarify something here. Was this thing floating, and was there any sort of ground movement of dirt or dust?
Yes, there was. That's a good question. Nobody's asked me that in about 10 years.
Okay.
Actually, what we talked about earlier, that propulsion system actually levitated and lifted up. Remember I said earlier, Daniel, there were pipes there? And the pipes went around the lower torso. I sent you a couple pictures there. Mm-hmm. And there's one actually of what the monster looks like. It's 2 shots. It's a 3D model.
Okay.
That's what the monster actually looked like. The pipes that were going around the lower portion were part of a propulsion system of some sort, and that's where the exhaust was coming out. That's what was rolling down the hill, was the exhaust. Mm-hmm. When Mrs. May and Lemon hit this thing with the lights, Mrs. May said it reacted to her, and I was very adamant. I was kind of pushy asking her questions.
Yeah. Well, Frank, I've got that 3D rendering there. Now, it appears that there's a single sort of lens there with an eye. You said eyes earlier. Right.
There actually is 2.
Okay, so it's just
you
the way
can just see one there. The other one is, they were set a few inches apart. Mm-hmm. So this is what you have here. See, the lower pipes is what the artist misinterpreted on the television show. Mm-hmm. And he drew that as the drapes. Mrs. May was trying to describe these rolling.
Does it seem that because this is a metallic type of entity, that maybe perhaps the whole thing was a probe?
Yes, exactly. It was some type of a probe. Now, when I spoke to Freddie May and started interviewing him and drawing the sketches that you saw earlier, he said this thing to him, he says it was definitely mechanical. Mm-hmm. He says not like that ridiculous drawing that everybody thought for years. That's why the public was disgusted, and the people of Flatwoods with this whole story and why they shut up. Mm-hmm. Because this is what the thing actually looked like, not that ridiculous drawing.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
And Freddie and Kathleen, what was really cool, Daniel, about this whole thing is being an illustrator and sitting down with these 2 people. And there's several, I also talked to a lot of other witnesses, and I did all these composites and these drawings, that I came up with from their descriptions. You see how far of a cry it was from what it really was, and you could see just how the story turned into a folklore because some half-ass illustrator, which we don't know his training or background, just screwed the whole story up for like a half a century until I stepped into the story.
Let me ask you,
by working with these people, they gave me really cool descriptions and precise descriptions. Now, Freddie May, he was about 50 feet or so away from the thing, Daniel, because he came to that fence, remember? And he was climbing over it. So he saw the whole thing unfold in front of him. Mm-hmm. So when I was doing my illustrations, I got a point of view from a person overlooking the whole scene from the back.
Yeah.
When I worked with Mrs. May and I talked with Neil Nunley quite a few times, and we corresponded, they saw this thing. It came out almost right on top of them.
Okay,
Mrs. May said she saw
Frank,
this thing the length of a small car away.
Okay, Frank, let me ask you. Frank, let me jump in here.
We were able to get a good
Frank,
overall.
Hang on for a second. I got to ask some questions in here. Now, what state was this in?
This was West Virginia.
Okay, now that's
Braxton County.
Right. Now that seems to me, especially in the older or old timey, that there are a lot of gun owners there and hunters. It seems to me if they saw some kind of craft or some kind of interference with their daily life, they would have went and grabbed their rifle. Did anybody grab the rifle and head up that mountain?
Well, what happened is another good question, because what happened is after this whole thing went down, okay, let me just finish up one little point. They saw the monster, okay, the so-called monster. It was actually some type of a probe craft. It passed in front of Mrs. May. Gene Lemon, Mrs. May said his legs went rubbery, and it was documented. He just kind of fell over, and his legs just gave out. He fell over. This thing passed in front of him, went by Nunley, and it was blowing dirt from the propulsion system, which actually would be like if you walk with a giant leaf blower. Mm-hmm. And this thing was 4 foot at the base. Mm-hmm. And it was blowing the dirt all over the place. It went into the field back out towards the craft, mm-hmm. and it left a path 4 foot wide. It looked like a giant leaf blower went through there.
Interesting.
When they analyzed the area later, it was actually two of them, one coming from the craft up towards the tree and the other one going back out. So everybody headed back to the house. And Mrs. May said she was so scared when she saw this thing, she passed most of the kids on the way back. Mrs. May was 32 years old. She said she darted by the kids, and she cleared that 3 to 3.5 foot fence like a hurdler.
Are you saying Mrs. Wait a minute? Are you saying Miss May did that?
Mrs. May was so goddamn scared. She told me. She said, "Frank, I cleared that fence in one leap. She didn't even touch it."
Now I had her picture up earlier. She looks like Grandma Mays right now. I guess she wasn't Grandma then. Is she a grandma?
Yes.
Okay.
She passed away a few years ago, but she was 32 at the time.
Okay.
And she was in shape, and she cleared that fence, that wooden fence. Then when they got back down towards the main cattle gate, and they were going off the farm, some of the kids went between the rungs, some of them went over it, some went under it, somebody opened it up. It was just like.
But she did a Jesse Owens leap.
Yeah, she sure did, and that's how scared she was. That's why all of these people were so aggravated and teed off at the public and making fun of them because what they really saw was there, and it wasn't the supposed. Maybe it was an owl in the tree that the government explanation gave later.
Yeah, we have a grandma in our live chat. I'm going to ask you, Grandma, do you feel like you would have been able to clear that too if you saw it? So let me ask something. Here's a question for you. Came in. It says, now have there been any other sightings of this monster again since then? Well,
what happened is I was able to track the craft. What happened, Dan, was when they went back to the farm, they contacted the local police department. Okay. The sheriff was out running around town looking for crashed aerial objects. They didn't know what the hell they were. They were crashing all over Braxton County. And to talk about the gun part, what they did is they contacted Ailey Stewart Jr., who was a photojournalist and co-owner of the Braxton Democrat over in Sutton. Now, because nobody was available to go up there. Police authority, the state troopers were out, the local police were out running around Braxton County getting calls of things crashing and the flames all over the sky, hitting mountains. They contacted Stewart because Stewart, being a photojournalist, he would go out on the road with the police and he would take scenes of the accident crime scenes and whatnot. So they knew him. So he was entrusted as the authority to go up to the farm. Now, when he went up to the farm to answer your gun question, they formed a posse.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
They had it looked like the militia going up there. Stewart told me he always would carry a shotgun. He always had 1 or 2 handguns. And they got all the local good old boys from around there. They went up there, and they were heavily armed. The kids were scared out of their minds. Stewart told me when he found out where this thing had happened, it was basically right in the backyard of the May house. He said none of the kids would go up there to show them where it happened. And a couple of the older boys went up there, and he said he had his hand on the back of one of the boys' neck, and he was basically dragging his ass up there. Yeah. And he said, quote unquote, he was crying like a whipped pup.
Well, he need to be scared. It sounds like he need to grow up and be a man. But let me say, well, here's what I found out myself. Riding an ATV through the forest, the boys that live in the forest, they say you never ever go into a forest without a gun.
Right.
And so it just strikes me as odd they didn't have a gun at the first time, but you said they created a posse and went on down. All right, let's get another question in for you, Frank Ficino. The question here is, did this thing have a sort of piercing eyes, as if it looked into your soul, those that made direct eye contact or eye to robot contact? Was it a piercing type of eye contact, or was it just random and didn't mean anything?
Okay, another great question. When I sat down with the witnesses, and I was doing the descriptions, like I said, Daniel, Mrs. May saw this thing up close. It basically came out on top of her. Ooh. She gave a description what it looked like, and Freddie did too. Now, the ridiculous descriptions of the monster with bulging eyes and this and that. If you look at this a little bit closer, Daniel, you're going to see, okay, where Freddy drew this thing, and then if you click back and you look at the mechanical monster, Freddy said they were not eyeballs, okay? What they were portholes. What this whole Flatwoods Monster actually was is the upper portion where it came to a peak, that ace of spades, okay? That was an outer helmet. The inner helmet, basically like looking at a fighter pilot inside of the cockpit, okay? That was like the cockpit area. The red head was actually a red helmet. Freddie May and Mrs. May were very, very precise and adamant. They said they were not eyeballs, they were portholes.
All right.
And what happened, and Freddie, up on the site when I interviewed him, he told me, he said, the eyeballs, the eyeballs as shown in the public, he said, what it actually was like looking across the street at your neighbor's house when the lights were on at night and that orange color that the windows glow. He says, but when Mother flashed the flashlight on this thing, it reacted to her and the whole inside of it lit up, and there were beams of light that actually were forced out of the hole of each one of these, like, portholes. That's what he described them as.
Yeah, that's pretty detailed
and
right there.
Later on, he told me, he gave me another description. He said it's like if you're sitting in your driveway at night and you go to start your car up, you turn the ignition, and all the lights come on your dashboard, and they're orange or blue, and everything glows and lights. He said that's what this thing was.
Okay. All right.
Freddie told me he believed that this thing was being piloted because it reacted and it was actually intelligently controlled, and he believed there was something inside of it.
Sounds kind of like a drone-looking thing. All right, we've got a number of questions coming in for you. Now, the Flatwoods Monster and that particular story has been covered, but it sounds to me like you've got a much more detail documented on that. So this question that's relevant to this question: What discovery did you make that all the others that tried to attempt to cover this story failed to see?
As far as the monster or the whole overall picture?
Let's go with the overall picture.
Okay. What I did, Daniel, is I read everything on planet Earth that I could get my hands on about the Flatwoods Monster case. I have newspaper articles from all over the world. I was even sent one recently from the Stars and Stripes military paper. And but to make a long story short, I took everything written about it. I took all of Gray Barker, who was one of the original investigators. He wrote an article in January of '53 about the Flatwoods Monster. And Ivan T. Sanderson, who was another investigator, he went there, but he didn't get there till a week later. Then there were other journalists and other investigators over the course of weeks that went to Flatwoods. I gathered everything up from all the books, the periodicals, the magazines, private papers. I was given a tour of the Gray Barker Museum in Clarksburg, West Virginia. The curator came in. He helped me make copies of some of the original notes. This was heavily documented by Sanderson. I took everything and I put it together, okay? Then I went out and continued my investigation, and I pieced everything together where all the little segments were missing. And what I discovered that nobody had looked into, and Sanderson did a little bit, except he missed the mark. He tried to shoot it at the target, and he missed it. But he was close. I give him a lot of credit. Where my story came into play, where I really went into gear, Daniel, is when I got hold of the Project Blue Book documents, the intelligence documents, okay? Now, I got the microfilm reel for the Flatwoods case. Well, it just wasn't the Flatwoods case. to give you an idea, when I got the microfilm reel years ago, I went over to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, where I did here in Daytona Beach, where I did a lot of my research. Mm-hmm. And I popped up the microfilm reel, and say like an average for one microfilm reel would be like for a whole month. The majority of the microfilm reel was just September 12th, 1952 alone. That gives you an idea of how many sightings happened on that night. Sanderson picked up a couple United Press articles about UFOs that were seen along the eastern seaboard. But when he wrote his book back years ago, and when Barker had researched the story back in the 50s, they did their initial investigations, and then they never went any further. Well, when the Blue Book documents were declassified and it came out on microfilm, nobody ever looked any further, so the case died right there. It took me 5 years just to go through approximately, there's about 100 pages of intelligence documents and try to figure out what the hell happened that night. Mm-hmm. And over the course of 20 years, what I was able to figure out, and by working with military people and retired vets, I was able to pinpoint 116 locations along the eastern seaboard over 10 states of where UFO sightings had occurred that night. And there was actually 21 hours of sustained sightings up and down the United States East Coast.
So is it likely then that this craft and this Flatwoods Monster then has been in other places in the country?
It was just one little part. Actually, the way to sum it up, Daniel, is the Flatwoods Monster case was basically the end of the story. What I did is worked in reverse. And I have this, and you could see it on the flatwoodsmonster.com. If you scroll down a bit on the homepage, you'll see where it says map, and you could click on that map. I put together a giant map I got from Embry-Riddle. It's an aeronautical pilot's map. Well, I pieced it together from Canada all the way down to Florida out west, and I have this wall-size map that I taped together that the pilots use. And as I went on over the years, Daniel, I would put stars and dots and different reference points, like you see in these cop shows when they're trying to find somebody and they're trying to figure out a pattern and they pinpoint everything. Well, I did this for several years. And then I worked with a couple different people, and one retired military guy in particular, and what he did is he came over to my place. We sat down, and he looked at the map, and he says, "Frank, do you know what you have here?" I said, "I have some sort of an idea, but I don't have a military background." And he says, "Well, I do." He says, "Hand me your ruler over there." Now I had a ruler, about a drafting ruler, about 4 foot long, off my drawing board. And he took it and took a pen and started drawing lines. And he started talking, and he stepped back, and he said, "Frank, do you know what you have here?" And I said, "Not really." And he started talking. And to make a long story short, when he started connecting the dots, I had the locations, I had the flight path trajectories, I had all the intelligence reports from Project Blue Book. Then I had dozens of newspaper articles, and what I did, Daniel, is I extracted the information out from each state where all these UFOs were seen, and I put the times and date stamps on them. So then we started putting all these little stickers on and writing the times, and we figured out the flight path trajectories. And the Flatwoods Monster craft was just one of 25 that were seen that night.
All right, we got to leave it there just for this first hour. Frank, here we go to about a 5-minute break. We keep you on the line. So before we go to a break, just stay on the line, please. Before we go to a break, what can people find in your book there, which I have in my background now?
Very good.
I'm just saying, would you like to say something about your book there?
I didn't understand you. Yeah, this is the most recent book here. This is my updated and revised edition This gives a little bit of background story of the summer of 1952 of the saucers, and this has all the interviews from everybody that I spoke to over the years, including all the witnesses and one of the key players in this, Colonel Dale Levitt. He was retired military, United States Army. He was actually contacted by Washington, and he went into Flatwoods with a battalion of men, and there was actually 180 troops from the National Guard that went through Braxton County,
Okay.
and that was all covered up, and I have an actual interview with Colonel Levitt, and the entire interview was in this book, and he basically spills his guts into what happened.
Okay.
It's one of the very rare instances where high-ranking military personnel came forward and talked.
Okay.
And I have that on video, and it's transcribed in the book in its entirety.
Okay. All right, Frank, just stay on the line there. We'll be right back with you. All right, everybody, you're watching and or listening to the Edge Television broadcast on our Newsmaker line tonight. Is, of course, Frank Fascino talking about the Flatwoods Monster. If you'd like to interact with this program, you can click on the Fast Blast link on the left side of the website, or you can join him in the live chat going on now. We'll take a 5-minute break. We're going to be right back.
Lightning, entertaining, and controversial. This is the Edge Radio program with your host, Daniel Ott.
And welcome back to the Edge Television broadcast. My name is Daniel Ott. If you have a question for tonight's guest, Frank Fascino, go to the edgeam.com website, click on the Fast Blast link, or join him in a live chat. This program will begin to replay immediately after the show, and then we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as well, and put it in our TuneIn radio playlist, as well as podcast program as well. Don't forget, next week, Gil Burchard is going to be with us talking about Planet 7X, and after that, April 23rd, Dave Hodges is going to be back with us, and then followed up by James Perloff. Now let's go back to our Newsmaker line and bring back with us Frank Fascino. Frank, welcome back.
Hey, Daniel.
Well, I'll tell you what you were describing in as we exited the first hour, Frank, was apparently sounded to me and some of the viewers as a War of the Worlds type of thing. Now, back in just right around World War II, there was a battle for L.A. where there was numerous attempts to bring down whatever was flying in the skies, and evidently was stationary in the skies of L.A. Was there any aircraft that was issued to chase these crafts, or how did all that go with the military?
Okay, well, basically to follow the timeline of what was going on, we had July 19th and 20th and 26th and 27th weekends, okay, July, where UFOs flew over D.C. in the Virginia area and fighter jets were scrambled out. Okay, now here comes the key point of this whole scenario. Back on July 28, 1952, shoot-down orders were revealed by the United States Air Force, and it's easier just to for me to give you a quote. The senior public information officer for the United States Air Force, here is the quote, as reported by the International News Service and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Lieutenant Colonel Mansell Mont's information officer stated, quote, the jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down. In Air Force parlance, this means that if a flying saucer refuses to land, jet pilots are authorized to shoot them to Earth if they can get close enough to do so. Now, this comes into play, Dana, because virtually every single day throughout the United States in 1952, someplace, somewheres, jets were being scrambled. This was at the time of the Cold War, and the United States was anticipating a possible attack by the Soviet Union.
The commies?
Right.
Or the Democrat Party?
This became a problem because there were so many UFO sightings. And, Daniel, what was reported to Project Blue Book that year is only a minuscule, teeny amount of what was actually seen, because the public would have to write into the Air Force and request the tentative observers questionnaire, get it back, and there were several pages just of a lot of stuff and, descriptions, where did you see it, what time, what direction, draw pictures, stuff like that. So most people didn't do that. So the reports that were actually sent to the Air Force, they were a lot for that year, but just a tiny amount was actually reported. So we have the shoot-down order that appeared only in a couple newspapers, the International News Service, the INS. Okay? After that was revealed, later we had the press conference, which was the biggest post-World War II press conference held at the Pentagon. Okay? That's when the Iron Curtain came down, and that's when basically everything was written off, the temperature inversions, and you know the same old story, the swamp gas and all the excuses came out. They had to tamp everything down and calm everything because the public was basically starting to hit near mass hysteria because UFOs were seen so much. Then we had everything going on over the Washington area, and actually there was a third weekend on August 5th, 1952, where jets were sent up into the air to chase after bogies. So we had the 3 weekends of the famous Washington sightings. Then, 6 weeks later, we have the Flatwoods Monster incident at the tail end of the summer. Now this, to answer your question before we went to break, this is what the other investigators did not get. When I put together the whole big picture of what was going on and all these different sightings, Daniel, that were seen that night, this took several years to piece together, and it was discovered through my 116 locations where witnesses had seen and reported UFOs that passed over their area, town, city, village, whatever. There were different objects seen, different times where they were seen, and different flight path trajectories. Now, just because there was descriptions of a object here, and here, doesn't mean that it was the same object. Well, what I had to do to differentiate is I went in, and when I figured out how many different sightings there were over the different states, being an illustrator, I actually did paintings, and I had them lined up around my house here. It looked like a gallery of where all these different crafts were, because they were so different, Daniel. There were some of them that were oval, some were round and they had flat bottoms. You had the cigar-shaped objects. There was all different types, and nobody could figure out, especially the original guys back in Flatwoods and Braxton County, why there were so many different descriptions of objects seen. And especially over the Washington area, there was a lot of different craft seen at low level.
So wait. Well, let me ask you something. First of all, was there any side effects to anybody that had seen the monster or the craft?
Yes, there was definitely.
And we got a bunch of questions to answer. Okay, can you answer that succinctly on that one? So let's move on. I got a bunch more questions coming in.
Yeah, Mrs. May told me that her boys were affected pretty good with it. They had inhaled this gas, and their nose. A lot of the kids, including her kids, their nose were bleeding.
Ooh.
Their eyes were swelled up. And what also happened is, she said, Freddie, the youngest boy, who I work with quite extensively, he had big dark brown spots appear all over his body, like big dark blotches. And she kept the two boys out of school for about a week. And she said the doctor Mrs. May even remembered the doctor's name. He was passed on. I tried seeing if I could get the medical papers, but they were long gone. His name was Bernard Hutchinson. And he was in Sutton, and she said the doctor gave the boys some type of an antibiotic shot.
Okay.
And Freddie was given a lot of antibiotic shots, and she said eventually these big brown spots all over his body disappeared.
Okay. All right, let's move on to another question here. And we're talking and the after effects. Were there any broken branches, radiation, scorch marks, anything like that from the craft?
No, and I actually found that out by talking to Mrs. May and a couple of the boys, and one of the key players I mentioned before break was Colonel Dale Levitt. I interviewed Colonel Levitt a couple times, and one of the times he let me videotape him. And it was kind of a question that I put forth to him. I said, were there any burn marks in the area? Because this thing was seen on fire flying across the sky, and when it stopped, the flames basically went out and this thing dropped. And Levitt was very adamant, and he says, and I says, were there any burn marks or anything? And he says, no, nothing at all. Nothing was singed, nothing was burned. And that was the area where he was up there after midnight with his troops. With
Now, back in 52, Frank, was there any such thing called or known as black helicopters?
Not that I know of, Daniel.
So was there any any retrieval attempt of the craft?
Well, what had happened, Daniel, is after Mrs. May and the kids saw this so-called monster, they ran back to the house. The path shows that it went back to its craft, and it was actually an area where this thing had touched down, and we have a path going up towards a tree and one going back. When it got back to the area where the craft was seen, it took off, and there was actually a local up there, and he actually saw the craft taking off and circled around the back area of the Fisher farm, and then it headed towards the Elk River. And this is interesting. I talked about this with Stanton Friedman quite often. When I started working with the topographical maps and following the flight paths of this object, it would fly over the roads and fly over the rivers. And Stanton said, Frankie said, that's what our pilots would do in World War II, especially if they were lost. If you were in a mountainous terrain area, you don't fly up over the humps and fly in between mountains. You follow the rivers.
Well, that's sort of what the Mothman did is he flew over a moving car.
Right, which would be a cleared area, which makes sense. You're not going to run into a tree on a road. Well, that's what the craft did. And what I did, Daniel, is I told you about the big map, which you can see on my website. I also have several other regional maps. Now, I got Braxton County maps, which were basically the hunters would use up there. And I put all of these Braxton County maps, pieced them together, and made one big one, and I followed the flight path. Now, like I said earlier, Gray Barker and Sanderson had spoke to witnesses back then. I used the witnesses and points of locations, and I time-stamped where they were seen. Then I talked to people up there, and then I talked to other witnesses who had seen the craft, and I also pulled out some of the original microfilm articles out of Braxton County from the local newspapers, especially the Braxton Democrat. And Ailey Stewart, the reporter, was the one talking to all these people. So I had the flight path, and I followed the craft, and it actually went 17 miles into the Frametown area, and it crashed in Frametown.
Did it appear on radar?
No, these things were flying under radar, Daniel.
Okay. All right.
The radar capability was 5,000 feet and above, so they were basically staying low.
Okay.
They were coming in so low and on fire, they were burning the.
When you say they, Frank, how many were there?
Okay. Let me jump back to what happened. When I told you I figured out there was 25 different craft, there was actually 24 smaller craft, and there was one sighted over later that night over Delaware that was described as the size of a dirigible. It was about the size of the Hindenburg, and that was flying at low level, and it was picked up on radar. And this was in the intelligence reports, and this thing sat off the coast at the end of the night. Well, what happened, Daniel, to cut to the chase, I was able to figure out that there were 4 damaged craft that night. Okay? Wow. These 4 damaged craft, 3 of them came in over the eastern seaboard. The first one came in, and it flew down towards Tennessee, and it penetrated the no-fly zone headed towards Oak Ridge National Laboratory. These UFOs knew the locations and strategic points of military installations in sensitive areas. It made a beeline right towards Oak Ridge. A second object came in flames and flying at low level, it went in the opposite direction and headed west and was making a beeline for Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, if you look at my map on the Flatwoods website, flatwoodsmonster.com, you can actually see the actual map that I worked on with the military people.
Okay.
The third object, Daniel, came in and threaded the needle and came right down the middle, and it actually passed over Washington, D.C., and it was flying very erratic. It was actually coming in at treetop level at some points. Mm-hmm. Now, at that point, this is a Friday night. It's approximately 7 o'clock. There's thousands of people in Washington, D.C., driving in their cars. They're walking with their kids and baby strollers, walking their dogs, getting ice creams, because it was a hot night. It was an Indian summer, and it was very hot that night. So a lot of people were outside. Mm-hmm. Okay, lack of air conditioning. Thousands of people are standing in the Virginia, Baltimore, and Washington area, and they're looking up, and they're seeing all these different craft coming in. This object, it was called by the New York Times the Flame over Washington. It came in at low level, Daniel, and headed west. What happened is all the intelligence reports from the people in the D.C. area had reported to the Air Force, and this is what they couldn't figure out, why there were so many descriptions of various different craft seen that night within a few minutes. Well, I made another map with a few other people, and what we were able to figure out by the timestamps, taking my paintings and setting them around, we were able to figure out that there was a dozen craft that dropped out of the sky and surrounded the third damaged craft, which was the Flatwoods Monster craft. Oh. Because, as I said earlier, this will come into play. When this craft flew over Washington, very erratic, treetop level, it was flying up, it was flying down, it was going crazy. It flew 200 miles west. And if you stand in Washington and you could see like Superman and look 200 miles west, you see the hilltop where this thing landed. So it came over the eastern seaboard, passed over Washington, went about 200 miles west, and went right into Braxton County. Mm-hmm. It hit the upper portion of Braxton County, overshot, and it flew a few miles down. It followed State Route 4, and that's when it passed over the kids.
So would you consider
that
what
I was able to do is work everything in reverse. And of all of these UFOs, these three were heavily damaged. They were seen exploding, pieces falling off of them, flying low level, and they were making repeated landings to see taken off. Now there was a fourth one that came up from the direction of Florida, and you will see this, and I have a documentary on YouTube you were showing a little bit ago, and you can actually see this fourth object came up from the southern part of the United States, and it actually crashed in North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And it was seen taking off again, and it flew, and it actually rendezvoused and touched bases in the area of Flatwoods. What happened, Daniel, is after the Flatwoods Monster craft flew west, okay, it passed over the area of Front Royal, West Virginia. When it passed safely over Washington, it was not intercepted. That's a no-fly zone.
How many of these craft? Hang on, Frank. I got to get some questions in here now. How many attempted interdictions were there with the Air Force?
Well, we have. What I did, Daniel, is we were able to retrace the flight paths of the three damaged objects back to a point that was 90 miles off the coast from Washington. Mm-hmm. If you see all the lines all intersect back there. And this is where the point of origin of all three of these objects came
so
from.
Did they scramble jets to intercept?
Well, that is the point where we have the best theory so far why these things came and damaged, because where the points intersected, and when I was standing with my military friend, and he pointed at the map, and he said, "Frank, do you see where these points intersect across from Washington, D.C.?" And I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Do you see what those 4 letters for that acronym are? ADIZ? That's the Air Defense Identification Zone." anything that flies into that area will be intercepted. And especially off the coast of Washington, the best jets were sent up. The perimeter of Air Force and Naval Air Stations had the best jets. And they would surround the Capitol, and he said it's not a coincidence. They intersected off the coast where Washington is, and they all came in damaged and crashed.
Okay, we've got another question for you.
Sure.
Some reports say that there were two monsters. One was metallic, and the other one was reptilian. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I do. What happened is after the Flatwoods craft took off, Dan, remember I said I traced it through the area across the river? Okay, it touched down, and I actually met another witness at a book signing a few years ago who actually saw it in her backyard. This thing touched down in Frametown, 17 miles away. Now, when it touched down into that area, it wasn't seen again, okay? But it's documented that was its furthest point. I actually traced it, Daniel, from 90 miles off the coast. It flew over Washington, flew over Front Royal, flew over Elkins. It flew over several different points, hit northern Braxton County, came down the State Road 4, and then it landed on a Fisher farm, took off, went into Frametown. That is the last known point of the Flatwoods Monster craft.
Okay, so who saw the reptilian monster?
Okay. 24 hours later, this was approximately 8 o'clock when it touched down in Frametown up in the mountains. 24 hours later, there was a fella from Queens, New York. His name was George Snatowski. Now, George Snatowski went from Queens into Ohio to visit some relatives. He was with his wife and their 18-month-old baby, and they drove through the area into Braxton County, and they were coming along the state road. They took a back road. They were trying to get back home, and their car stalled. And at that point, that is what was actually seen on the Monster Quest episode, which they called the Lizard Monster or Lizard Beast, whatever they called it. And at that point, the car had stalled, and George Snatowski rolled his window down and went to step out of the car, and that's when the whole area was engulfed with this sulfur smell. Now, he thought a chemical factory in the area was on fire because, once again, you had this smell of this sulfur and burning metal. He got out of his car, he went and he checked it. It was basically a new battery he had for the trip. And when he lifted up the hood, he's monkeying around, checking the wires and the cables. Now it's starting to get dark. The smell is starting to engulf the area quite a bit more. The babies in the back seat. Back in that day, Dan, they had these little baby cribs. No baby seats. The kid was plopped into this crib. His wife is sitting on a passenger side up front, and the whole area is starting to get engulfed with the sulfur smell. He can't get the car started. He turns around and he looks off in the distance, and he sees this purplish glow of something bobbing way out in the woods into a cleared area. And he said it was like a purplish frosted lamp color. Now, Mrs. May also told me the night before.
Now, wait a minute. I know that you've got a lot of description there, but I'm just my question is, did he see a reptilian monster?
Yeah, that's the point I'm getting at.
We got to get there a little quicker, man. You lost me a couple hours ago there.
And his wife starts screaming hysterically.
Okay.
She's like Fay Ray when she saw Kong. She's freaking out. George, turn around, look behind you. Now, he starts stumbling back from walking out to the woods to see what was up there. He turned around, and off behind him is this reptilian figure that's, he said, quote unquote, a good 9 foot tall. He saw Daniel from the waist up. What it actually was the Flatwoods Monster with the upper portion of its spacesuit seen off. And there's an illustration that you have there that actually shows what this thing looked like. what had happened.
So I've got a picture in my archive
Yeah, it's
here.
a black and white.
Okay, the black and white. All right, let me get to it.
Yeah,
then.
it's a black and white one.
Okay. You say that's a spacesuit? Does it look like he's in a farm field?
Yeah, it's a black and white illustration. What Snitowski actually saw was the Flatwoods Monster. Mind you, it had the pipes from the waist down. He saw this thing hovering towards about the edge of the road, and it was coming towards him, and it was emitting the same sulfur-type smell.
Well, now this illustration here shows some kind of reptilian head.
Right. There's another one there that shows it. It's a black and white illustration that shows the body, the arms.
Uh-huh. Yeah, we've got that one too, right here. I'll get it up here. Is it this one here?
That's it.
Yeah. Okay. So this reptilian. So evidently, then the device that again, going back to Star Trek, that kind of looks like the original captain of the Enterprise. He had to move around in a thing that looked like that. But so you think this is what allowed him to move around?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Almost like a flying humanoid, a type of a flying humanoid looking thing.
Yeah, it's like inside of it, and you could see, Daniel, if you go up to the waist. Now, from what Colonel Levitt told me when he was on site with the Army, he said they measured up to the branch, and the branch of the tree where this thing hovered in Flatwoods was just about 12 foot tall. So this thing was just under 12 foot tall.
Sort of like a Nephilim.
He said it was 9 foot tall here. Now, if you keep continuing up the sides, you're going to see it tapers up to the shoulders, then put a 3-foot helmet on top of it, put a round head like a helmet. It was actually protective gear. Mm-hmm. And that's what the witnesses had told me. They said this thing was being controlled, and they think there was something on the inside.
By the way, we were talking about it was Captain Pike that was driving around in some kind of device that looked like this because his body had been misconfigured by the aliens trying to reassemble him after they crashed on a strange planet. Okay, so this looks like the classic alien reptilian. You think this is fine? Normally they're in the ship, or they, as a reptilian, they morph into a human body. So is this then? Does that give you credence with the other UFOologists saying that the reptilians are the actual ones that was driving these, or maybe controlling the other metallic ones?
Well, this was the Flatwoods Monster interior, and this is what Snitowski described to me. Now, what's interesting, I talked to him on the telephone, then I found the original articles in the magazine back from 1955. What's interesting about this whole thing is that back in 1952, the original investigator, Ivan Sanderson, he went up to one of the crash sites, and he actually found this area where one of the ships went down, and he found all of this pieces of shrapnel, and he said it looked to him like it was dried up snake or turtle eggshell.
Ooh.
And this stuff was all splattered around the area of another crash site. Remember I said earlier the police were out running around to different crash sites? Well, there was another crash site, and when he had this looked at and analyzed, he said it looked more like the skin of a snake more than anything else. And when he had it analyzed by my Monsanto chemical company in Charleston, it contained aragonite, and it was porous, and he says it actually gave the description of a reptile shell. Mm-hmm. And this stuff was splattered all outside where one of the other craft had touched down.
Okay. All right,
we put together that information plus the descriptions of a reptilian, and that's what it seems to have been, Daniel.
Okay. All right, let's ask on a more mundane note, Frank, is this your sole, has this been your sole pursuit? The pursuit of truth of the Flatwoods case, or I mean, do you have, say, a job and it's kind of like a sideline thing?
No, this is what I do full time.
So you are the quintessential expert.
This engulfed me.
You have been certainly engulfed in the Flatwoods case for sure. Let's get to another couple of questions. Keep them, if you can keep your answers short, we can get to a lot more of them here. One, do you think this was a decoy event? Because you described multiple craft coming in. So a decoy event while massive landing took place somewhere else, maybe at a secret base?
No, the conclusions that myself and my boys that I worked with what happened, Daniel, is when this thing came in and it touched down, the other craft came in. It was a search and rescue mission. The one thing that was driving Gray Barker out of his mind, and he documents it in his books, he said for the life of him, he would love to know why there were so many different varied descriptions of craft seen over Braxton County that night. And what happened, Daniel, is they actually came in looking for it. And I was able to document every single damn location, move, timestamp of every single one that came in there. And that took about 15 years to figure out.
Okay. All right, let's get to another question then. Speaking of reptilians, Hillary Clinton's campaign just recently said that they believe that people can handle the truth concerning UFOs. So do you think that our government knows about it and we're getting closer to a disclosure?
Sure, the government knows about it. They've known about this thing going on for 100 years. It goes back a lot further. It goes back into the 1800s. And what was the rest of the question?
Well,
the government and disclosure?
Yeah,
no, I don't think there's going to be disclosure.
Well, I mean, being that Hillary may likely be the president, and therefore being a reptilian, she may feel empathy toward her fellow reptiles.
Well, I don't know about that portion of it. And I don't know about Hillary being president either, but I don't think the government at this point, they're not going to disclose everything. I think it's going to take a major event like they talked about with basically landing on the White House lawn for that to happen. And that almost happened this night, Daniel. This thing almost did touch down in Washington. Massive cover-up of a search and rescue mission of 4 damaged craft. And if we had about another week, I could go through and I could give you every pinpointed location of where my document.
Well, from what I've heard so far, I will guarantee you are absolutely right on that there. And what about this? Somebody suggested there may have been one of the craft spraying poison gas. Anything on that?
Well, that's how they portrayed it on the Monster quest of the poison gas coming out. What it actually was, it was the exhaust system.
That's strange. That's
propulsion.
That's strange technology for advanced creatures.
Yeah, I don't know. I know sulfur is some type of a cooling agent, isn't it? Well,
it may be, but it's also a portal to the devil, the damn devil. So we got these reptilians coming in, but it sounds to me this may be the first time that a reptile has been kind of out and about, like a nightly stroll type of thing, where normally they're kind of hid or they they transform and mutate into humans to fool us. But so a lot of times, like in the movie, the one with I can't get the name of it. What's the name of it?
The Day the Earth Stood Still?
No, not that one. It was with I can't think of. Oh, Signs. It was Signs. Yeah, in Signs they said that there was a couple aliens came down and they were actually scouting the planet for the rest of them. They're getting ready to bring the rest of them in. It sounds to me like this is a scouting mission went horribly wrong. Started crashing their spaceships and crashing into one another and had all kind of problems. But that don't sound like
some type of reconnaissance mission.
Well, yeah, but it doesn't sound like they
were shocked.
It doesn't sound like they got good enough tech to take us on.
Well, what happened, Daniel, is researching over at Embry-Riddle and working with different pilots and whatnot, I discovered back in 1952, basically we had bullets, okay, up until that point. And in 52, the United States fighter jets began to use the deadlier, more powerful arms. And there was actually 3 fighter jets. It was the F-86D Sabre Dog. It carried 24 rockets. The F-94C Starfire was introduced in July of 52, and that carried rockets as well as the Cutlass that the Navy used. Now, they were called folding fin aerial rockets, and they were 2.75-inch rockets, and they had a 7.5-pound warhead of dynamite. And these things, they traveled, the rockets traveled at about 2,500 feet per second. Now, what a surprise that would have been, all of a sudden, a bunch of UFOs just up there doing reconnaissance, and bang. Now, Stanton Friedman talked to me from his point of view. He says the aliens knew the drop-off rate to the bullets and how fast our planes were going back then, okay? And they knew the length, the velocity of the bullets, and blah, blah, how that. Now, what a surprise, all of a sudden, they're not shooting bullets anymore. They know the drop-off rate. All of a sudden, they go up there, and the jets basically look the same, and now they're firing rockets at them. You know, they have an effective range, you know, the 3,700 yards, 3.5 miles, and they're going 2,500 feet per second. That would have surprised the hell out of them. It's like, oh, no, they ain't bullets anymore. We just got screwed. Now, you could picture a bunch of rocket-bearing jets up in the air firing hundreds and thousands of rounds of these rockets and hitting these craft. Now, the point that I didn't understand when I was doing my research of why all 3 points of the damaged crafts off the eastern seaboard intersected at the same point. My buddy said to me, he said, you're looking at this too one-dimensional. He said, take that damn map down off the wall. We took it down, and we laid it out on the floor, okay, in the den. He said, pull out some coins. You got them in your pocket, and he took the 3 coins I handed him, and now we're looking down on the map laying on the floor. He says, okay, and he took the 3 coins, and he held them up over the exact point where all 3 intersected below on the ground. And he dropped 3 coins out of his hand. And I said, what's your point? What are you getting at? He said, my hand is the mothership.
Whoa.
Way above the atmosphere. And he dropped all 3 coins, and they all dropped on top of each other and intersected into the same point. He said, Frank, I'm going to tell you what happened. When they dropped down on reconnaissance, what you mentioned earlier, they were watching. He said they got blasted by our jets when they were dropping out of the sky. That's why all 3 points intersected in the air defense identification zone 90 miles off the coast. He said they got whacked, and they surprised the hell out of them. He says, and all 3 damaged ships went inland. And when they went inland, they had definite targets. They were pissed off, Daniel. One flew down towards Wright-Patterson. The other one went to Oak Ridge, and the third one flew right over the Capitol. It's not a coincidence. They hit 3 of the major security-sensitive areas over the United States. And the third one that came in is the one that landed in Flatwoods.
One of our astute chatters there just put up a picture of a newspaper clipping called Braxton County. Residents faint, become ill after run-in with weird 10-foot monster. And I guess that is alluding to the Flatwoods Monster. So this monster's out there just affecting people pretty much. But now the size of the thing kind of reminds me of like a Nephilim. I'm wondering if it's more of a sort of a supernatural being, or you think it was just organic?
I can only go by what was described to me and what I read through my research of the past investigators. When I talked to George Snitowski, and it was basically some type of a snake reptilian-looking thing, and then going by the chemical analysis back at Monsanto that
well, there you go.
Mr. Sanderson had. You know, we're combining everything what this thing looked like, what I was told, and that's a conclusion we came up with. Some type of a reptile or snake thing.
Amazing connection to Monsanto. You know, them bastards over there doing weird stuff.
Sir.
Got more pictures.
It's a coincidence they just happened to bring it to them, right?
They probably created it in one of their labs down there. Doing, you know, one of their genetically modified organisms got in. You know, they gave it to a snake or something and turned into some kind of weird 10-foot monster that's haunting people. So with your I don't want to say fixation, Frank, but man, you've dedicated a large portion of your life to ferreting this thing out. So do you have nightmares of this thing floating around in your brain at night, or what?
No, not at all.
It's going to get you, Frank. that thing is still out there. I imagine it is still out there.
Maybe.
I mean, if I go to some woods somewhere, am I likely to run into this thing?
I doubt it. I think they left that night, and I don't think they want to come back to Earth. Very warlike. They went through a lot of hell that night to get their damage.
Well, these sound like some pretty dumb bastards.
And actually, there
was
another one that went down, Daniel, up in Wheeling area. Remember the second one I told you I came in damaged? It flew over Baltimore, and it flew up towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Right. Here's the interesting part. When you look at my map, when the Flatwoods craft flew over Washington, and it passed over the capital area, and it wasn't taken down because it should not have been flying over Washington. When it flew over D.C. and was not touched, the other two craft turned away and went back in the opposite direction right when that thing cleared past Washington. And the one that flew over Wright-Patterson flew back northeast, flew back south, and it actually touched down and landed in the area of Ogilvy Park, which is a big park up in the northern panhandle. Well, there was another sighting and another story of a gigantic monster that was seen up in that area. So we actually had two different aliens that went down, and the cover story for that one was a badly burned body of a woman was found in that area just outside of Wheeling.
Really?
And then there were rumors of a monster that was seen. So we have the Flatwoods one and in the area where it crashed, and then we have another one up in the Wheeling area, and they called that one Bassville Billy. So there were search parties in both areas. The one up in the Wheeling area, Daniel, it was so massive, it was seen by thousands of people. It was seen in eastern Ohio, the West Virginia Panhandle, and western Pennsylvania in the area of Pittsburgh. There were so many sightings of things flying out of the sky coming down looking for this thing. They called it a meteor shower. Well, there were no meteor showers. There were no meteors on September 12th, 1952, except in Project Blue Book's intelligence report, which called all of these sightings one meteor.
That sounds, or swamp gas. Have you ever heard of the Brown Mountain sightings in North Carolina?
Yes, I have.
So
I don't know a lot, or them, but I've been told about them.
So do you attend various UFO meetings, and do you get to speak at these, or do you just go to them, or what do you do?
Oh, over the years?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Since 2004, just up until a couple of years ago, I was touring all over the United States.
Have you yourself seen a UFO, Frank?
Yes, I have, in Braxton County.
Braxton County?
Braxton County's where all of this happened, Daniel. There were crop circles appearing up there. When I started going up there, when I found out about the Flatwoods Monster incident, my cousin and different people in the area actually had big, gigantic crop circle rings appearing on their property overnight. And I was put in touch with Colin Andrews. I gave him all my research, all my photographs, everything I gave to Colin. And that's when I first started getting a little bit more involved in this, was with the crop circle stuff. And the people up in the mountains there don't talk about it a lot because you have the memory of being made fools out of talking about the Flatwoods Monster. So you never got a lot of the people talking outside the community, but there's still a lot of UFO sightings going on up there.
Now, there's also a lot of shine drinking up there too, ain't they?
Not really. You would really be surprised of the way the people are up there. It's certain parts of the area in the hollers, it's still like it was 100 years ago.
They're all related, aren't they?
But it's a new generation of people up there, and a lot of responsible families. A lot of money's coming into the area. But I've seen them. There's pictures of UFOs on my website. If you look into my blog site, I have a couple nice photographs of some UFOs that I took with time-lapse exposure.
Now, have you walked around inside of crop circles?
Yes, I have. A matter of fact, the ones that were on my cousin's property back then, and it was kind of weird because there's photographs of those as well on my website, Daniel, and the Paratopia blog site area. There's the biggest one was about 68 feet across, and they were on the inside of a pasture that was at about a 45-degree angle. Picture a bowl. All of these rings and all little designs were through this one area on the property. And I was actually walking down the hill one day taking photographs to give to Colin Andrews. And I walked into the biggest one, and it was kind of weird. It was in the fall time. It was cool. It was in the 70s. And the whole area got hot as I walked into that area with the camera. I had a Pendex K1000. I was taking stills. And when I walked into the area, do you know what they call black ice?
Yeah.
Where everything gets wavy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? The whole area turned into, it was getting wavy like that.
Really?
And I started to stagger, and I don't know what the hell it was, but I didn't want to roll down the hill and go down about 50, 60 yards down the bottom into where all the cattle were. But I just sat down. But it was kind of weird. And I haven't talked about that, oh, God, probably over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what happened when I walked into the biggest ring. Mm-hmm. I was photographing them.
You didn't have any herb with you down there, did you?
No.
Now you seem like you have you're researching was what appears to happen sort of in the southern type living situation, but you kind of sound like a northerner.
Yeah, I sure am. I'm from Connecticut.
Okay.
And actually, it's funny you said that, because when I was talking with Ailey Stewart Jr., who broke the Flatwoods Monster story, when I was up at his house in North Carolina, I actually stayed at his house for about 3.5 to 4 days. And we did our interview, and since he was the one that was the first one up there of authority, it was a gold mine of information I was able to get from him. Well, we finished up there talking, and when I was getting ready to go back home to get in the car with my buddy, he looked at me and he says, "Frank, God only knows. I don't know how you did it." He said, with that northern Yankee accent, how you got all that information out of those people in West Virginia. He said, "They must like you."
It's hard for them. It's hard for them mountain people to get along with northerners,
But the whole thing is that I vindicated the people up there, because I got the proof, I got the evidence, I got the documentation. Nobody had ever realized, and that was your question about an hour ago, what have I done that nobody else did? I was able to piece this whole thing together and figure out there were 10 states where UFOs were seen over 21 hours, and the crux of it took place in approximately 1 hour. And that was a good chunk of the sightings. And I have lists and lists and lists and pages and chapters in my book that actually document and show, and I give my cross-reference of where all these things happened. It's actually quite scary. Back then, I could see why the government did cover it up. Because one thing you have to remember, now Stewart kept reminding me of this. I interviewed him in 1996. He said, "Frank, you have to remember what was going on back then in that era." He said the public was panicking. What was going on in 52. And he said, you also have to remember that the communication is not today in 96 as it was in 52. And that's why everybody missed the boat on it, because people didn't know what was going on 2 towns away, let alone what was going on 10 states away. So with modern communications and computers and working with librarians around the country, I was able to pull out all this information, Daniel. And the main pivotal point of this whole thing was the Project Blue Book documents that I got from the intelligence reports. They were loaded with tons of information. And once I would catch on to a trail, you just follow the trail. And I followed the intelligence trail and plotted points on the map. And once I got into a certain area, I would contact that city or town, and I would ask the librarian, can you pull out information about flying saucers, meteors, or any flaming objects that were seen over that area? And they would send me all this information back. So I virtually have a storage unit chocked with information just on the Flatwoods case and Air Force and military stuff. Thousands of books, magazines, periodicals, and doing shows like this, Daniel, people will run into the local libraries, because there's no way I can hit every library between Florida and New York out towards Ohio, that whole triad, and figure out what happened. But I got it through the Project Blue Book documents, and then I'm still getting people contacting Stan Friedman and myself, give me more information about.
Is Stan still doing interviews? It's about time for him to come back on our program.
Yeah, he sure is.
Okay.
He sure is. Stan was a key player that worked with me and supported me over the years.
Yeah, very good, very good.
And he's a great guy. And Alfred Lemberg too. He's been worth his weight in gold. He's a really good guy. Alfred Lemberg wrote the back cover review for my book, and he's retired military personnel. And Daniel, guys from World War II to Korea to Vietnam to the Middle Eastern wars have helped me over the past 25 years. And it was without those guys I couldn't have done it. Because they really came to bat for me, and they helped me with this, all my research.
I had your picture up there for a second in the live chat. Somebody said one person said you look like George Norrie of Coast to Coast. Another person said you look like Ron Jeremy. Which person would you rather be?
I don't know. Some people said when I was a little bit younger I looked like Tom Selleck. I'll go with Tom Selleck.
All right, put that one in there too. Well, listen, Frank Fascino, we are at the end of the broadcast. Anything you'd like to say in the final moments? You go right ahead.
Well, Flatwoodsmonster.com has a lot of information that we've talked about, from the crop circles to the UFO photographs to missing pilots, and you can actually see, once you scroll down a few inches on the website, Daniel, on the homepage, you'll see a link that goes to YouTube, and you show the beginning of it, and it's about 40-something minutes long, and it's a synopsis of my book on YouTube, and it actually has highlights of all the interviews, like Colonel Levitt, Mrs. May, Freddie May, the key characters that I write about in the book. I show clips of them in the interviews, and you see a lot of video footage. Daniel, I have thousands of hours of footage of Braxton County and documenting the tree and the Bailey Fisher farm before it was taken back over and sold and turned into a dude ranch. I have pictures of how it looked back in the days from going back there since 1990, 91. So you can see a lot of this stuff I talked about tonight and see the actual footage and photographs of it.
Okay. All right, Frank Fascino, I appreciate you coming on the Edge television broadcast tonight.
It was a great interview. Good job, man.
All right, then.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. All right, everybody, that was Frank Fascino talking about the Flatwoods Monster. You know he's out there, those reptilians, and I'm still thinking there's a connection between Hillary Clinton, and the reptiles. And sometimes, you might think that a reptile will get on a broom, and if it wasn't a broom, then it'd be Hillary Clinton. Well, hey, stay tuned. Next week, Gil Burchard's going to be talking about Planet 7X. Now, if you had a hat with 7 X's, that means it's 7 beaver hat. So, I don't even know how many I got here. I think I like 10 beaver, but it could be. Anyway, next week, Gil Burchard's Planet 7X, 2 weeks. Dave Hodges is going to be with us talking about political anarchy. The captain of chaos will probably come up in the conversation, otherwise known as Donald Trump. And in April 30th, James Perloff is going to talk about global destruction. Well, it's all coming this way, man. There's a lot of things happening. Man, you just got to be ready. And the only way to be ready is to watch the television broadcast. All I can tell you. This program begin to replay directly after the show. Like I say, if you do not refresh your browser, you'll see the entire show. If you do refresh your browser, then you're going to end up seeing the edited version, which is not bad. It's the exact guest interview without the 5-minute break, without the beginning and the rainy points, nothing. So there you go. You can watch the show again. And I'm looking forward then in opening up in May. Shannon Ray Davis will do a mass exorcism. And y'all know some of you out there got some demons. Okay. You got some demons because you're not contributing to the show. So we're going to get them demons out of you. And then, May 14th, Dr. Kevin Randall. He says doctor, but he's actually a retired Air Force. And he is widely recognized as a preeminent UFO authority there, and he knows about the inside cover-up. We're going to find out the truth every Saturday night right here on the Edge Television broadcast. Thank you, everyone, for participating with the show. You can reach me at edgeam@yahoo.com, and you can listen to this broadcast again on TuneIn Radio, our TuneIn Radio program, our YouTube channel, and podcasts as well. We're going to make a couple of updates on the show, or on the website about the show, so you'll be looking forward to that. Well, that's a wrap for us this evening. Daniel Ott for the Edge. Bye-bye.